Chapter 12, Taking to the Skies, The Perils of Early Airmail, 1918 to 1925. Before we dive into today's story, make sure you're subscribed because trust me, you won't want to miss the twist I have coming next week. The history of the mail has always been a battle against friction. It has been a struggle against the mud of the road, the friction of the wheel, and the resistance of the water. For thousands of years, the speed of information was limited by the speed of the earth itself, how fast a horse could gallop, how fast a wheel could turn. But in the early 20th century, humanity looked up. Above the mud, above the mountains, above the forests, there was a highway that required no paving. It was infinite, smooth, and empty. It was the sky. Chapter 12 of our history is the story of the moment the mail left the ground. It is a story of wood, wire, canvas, and courage. It is the story of the airmail service, a government experiment that was equal parts visionary and suicidal. The years are 1918 to 1925. The setting is the open cockpit of a biplane, suspended 5,000 feet above a sleeping continent. To understand this era, we must strip away our modern understanding of aviation. Forget the pressurized cabin, the radar, the autopilot, and the stewardess serving coffee. Imagine, instead, a kite with an engine. The plane of choice for the early airmail was the Curtiss JN-4, affectionately known as the Jenny. It was a surplus trainer from World War I. It was built of spruce wood and Irish linen, doped with lacquer until it was tight as a drum. It was held together by piano wire and turnbuckles. It had an open cockpit. There was no glass between the pilot and the elements. The engine was a Curtiss OX-5, a V8 water-cooled beast that spat oil and vibrated so violently it could numb a man's hands in minutes. It produced 90 horsepower, less than a modern Honda Civic, to drag this fragile bird into the air. On May 15, 1918, the United States inaugurated its first scheduled airmail route between Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and New York. The launch was a high society affair. President Woodrow Wilson stood on the polo grounds of Potomac Park in Washington. He held his top hat in his hand. The First Lady was there. The Postmaster General was beaming. The pilot was a young Army lieutenant named George Boyle. He climbed into the cockpit, looking dashing in his leather helmet and goggles. The bags of mail were loaded. The crowd cheered. Contact! The mechanic swung the propeller. The engine coughed and died. They swung it again. Nothing. The president looked at his watch. The embarrassment was palpable. Finally, someone looked in the fuel tank. It was empty. In the excitement, they had forgotten to gas up the plane. After fuel was siphoned from nearby airplanes, Boyle took off. He climbed into the blue sky, circled the Washington Monument, and turned south. He was supposed to go north to Philadelphia. Lieutenant Boyle followed the wrong set of railroad tracks. He got lost. He ran out of fuel again and crashed in a field in rural Maryland, just 25 miles away from where he started. The mail was eventually put on a train. It was an auspicious start. It proved that the sky was not easily tamed. But the post office did not quit. They hired a new breed of men. They were no longer Army detailees. They were civilians. They were the wanderers, the barnstormers, the adrenaline junkies of the Jazz Age. They called themselves the Suicide Club. Between 1918 and 1925, the life expectancy of an airmail pilot was roughly 900 flying hours. 31 of the first 40 pilots hired were killed. Let us step into the boots of one of these pilots. It is 1920. You are standing on a grassy airfield in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. It is known as the Hell Stretch because of the fog that clings to the Allegheny Mountains. You put on your gear. It is a ritual of survival. First, the silk scarf, not for fashion, but to prevent the rough wool collar of your coat from chafing your neck raw as you constantly turn your head to scan the horizon. Then the heavy leather coat lined with sheepskin. Then the fur-lined boots. Then the helmet and the goggles. You are about to enter a world of extreme sensory violence. You climb in. The cockpit is tiny. You are sitting on top of the gas tank. In front of you, in a separate compartment, is 400 pounds of mail. The engine roars to life. The noise is deafening. It is a physical pressure against your chest. You take off. The ground falls away. The farmhouse becomes a toy. The cow becomes a speck. Up here, you are the loneliest man in the world. There is no radio. You cannot talk to the ground. You cannot talk to other pilots. You are alone with the wind and the machine. Navigation is primitive. You fly by what they called the iron compass. You look down over the side of the cockpit, the wind tearing at your face, and you find the railroad tracks. You follow the tracks. If the tracks go through a tunnel, you fly over the mountain and hope you pick them up on the other side. If the weather is good, it's glorious. You are a god looking down on creation. But the weather is rarely good. The greatest enemy of the airmail pilot was fog. In a time before instrument panels, if a pilot flew into a cloud, he lost all sense of up and down. His inner ear would betray him. He would enter a graveyard spiral and fly straight into the ground without ever knowing it. So they flew low, terrifyingly low. To stay under the clouds, pilots would fly 10 feet above the trees. They would fly down the main streets of small towns, looking at the store signs to figure out where they were. There was a technique known as flying the wet wash. If a pilot was lost, he would look for laundry hanging on clotheslines. If the clothes were blowing east, he knew the wind direction. But the real challenge, the frontier that had to be conquered if airmail was ever to replace the train, was the night. The train moved 24 hours a day. The plane, until 1921, stopped at sunset. A plane would fly the mail from New York to Cleveland during the day, then transfer the mail to a train for the night leg, then back to a plane the next morning. It was a relay system that was barely faster than the all-rail route. To win, the mail had to fly in the dark. This brings us to the most legendary night in the history of the Postal Service, February 22, 1921. Congress was threatening to cut off funding for the airmail. They said it was a waste of money. They said it was too dangerous. The post office needed a miracle. They decided to attempt the impossible, a continuous transcontinental flight, day and night, from San Francisco to New York. 4 planes took off, 2 from the east, 2 from the west. The 2 planes from the east were grounded by a snowstorm. One of the planes from the west crashed in Nevada. The pilot survived. That left 1 plane, 1 pouch of mail. It made it to Salt Lake City, then to Cheyenne, then to North Platte, Nebraska. At North Platte, a pilot named Jack Knight was waiting. Jack Knight was suffering from a broken nose from a previous crash and was wrapped in bandages. It was freezing cold, high winter on the Great Plains. He took off from North Platte and flew to Omaha. He landed at 1 a.m. in the pitch black. He was exhausted. He had done his part. But at Omaha, there was bad news. The relief pilot, who was supposed to take the mail to Chicago, hadn't shown up. The weather was too bad. A blizzard was raging over Iowa. The flight was dead. The experiment was over. Jack Knight looked at the mail sacks. He looked at the blizzard. He had never flown the Omaha to Chicago route before. He didn't know the landmarks, and he certainly hadn't flown it at night in a snowstorm. He climbed back into his cockpit. "I'm going," he said. What followed is the Paul Revere's ride of aviation. Jack Knight took off into the darkness. He had a torn road map on his knee, illuminated by a flickering flashlight held between his teeth. The wind battered the biplane. The snow stung his face like needles. The temperature dropped to 0. He couldn't see the ground. He couldn't see the stars. But then he saw a light. Down in the black void of the prairie, a tiny orange spark flickered, then another, then another. The post office had telegraphed ahead. They had asked the farmers and the mayors of the towns along the route to help. The bonfires. Imagine this scene from the ground. A farmer in Iowa, bundled in his coat, standing in his snowy field at 3 a.m. He hears a faint droning buzz of an engine in the clouds. He lights the pile of old tires and hay soaked in kerosene. The roar roars up. It is a beacon of human solidarity. Up in the sky, Jack Knight sees the glow. He corrects his course. He flies from fire to fire, a moth moving between candles. He made it to Iowa City, but he was running out of gas. The ground crew there had gone home, thinking no one was crazy enough to fly. Knight circled the dark airport until a night watchman heard him and ran out to light a red flare. Knight landed on the snow. He kept the engine running. He ate a ham sandwich while the watchman refueled the Jenny. He took off again. The sun began to rise as he crossed into Illinois. The gray light of dawn revealed the smoke of Chicago. He landed at Maywood Field at 8:40 a.m. He was half frozen. His face was frostbite where the goggles didn't cover, but he had the mail. Because of Jack Knight, the transcontinental flight was completed in 33 hours and 20 minutes. The fastest train took 72 hours. The airmail was saved. But the government knew they couldn't rely on bonfires forever. They needed infrastructure. They needed to industrialize the night. Between 1923 and 1925, the post office built the transcontinental airway system. It was the lighted highway. They built a chain of 600 steel towers from New York to San Francisco. Each tower was 50 feet tall and topped with a rotating beacon, a spotlight of 1 million candle power. These beacons were spaced 10 miles apart. On a clear night, a pilot could see 3 or 4 of them in a line, stretching out like a string of pearls. At the base of each tower was a concrete arrow. These arrows were massive, 70 feet long, painted bright chrome yellow. They were embedded in the ground, pointing the way to the next beacon. Even today, if you hike into the deserts of Utah or the scrublands of Nevada, you can still find them. The towers are gone, but the concrete arrows remain, moss-covered and cracked, pointing the way for ghosts. This system changed the nature of the job. The pilots were no longer guessing. They were following the lights. Let us capture the atmosphere of a night flight in 1924. You are flying the night mail over Ohio. It is 2 a.m. The engine is a steady, rhythmic thrum, a lullaby of combustion. Below you, the world is asleep. You see the dark shapes of the forests and the silver ribbon of the river reflecting the moon. And ahead, every 10 seconds, the beacon sweeps the sky. Flash! It is a hypnotic experience. You are suspended in a void, guided by a lighthouse on the prairie. You feel a profound sense of peace. You are the guardian of the letters. In the sack behind you, there are bank checks clearing millions of dollars. There are love letters. There are films for the cinema. You are the veins of the economy, pumping blood while the body sleeps. But the era of the government airmail pilot was coming to an end. The success of the service was its own undoing. The post office had proved that aviation was viable. It had built the airports, it had built the beacons, it had trained the pilots. Now the government wanted to step back and let capitalism take over. In 1925, Congress passed the Kelly Act. This law authorized the Postmaster General to contract the mail routes out to private companies. This was the big bang of the airline industry.
Small, scrappy companies formed to bid on the contracts. Route number 4, Salt Lake to Los Angeles, went to a company called Western Air Express. Route number 1, Boston to New York, went to Colonial Air Transport. Route number 6, Detroit to Cleveland, went to a company owned by Henry Ford. These companies were not interested in passengers, not at first. Passengers were heavy, they complained, and they needed bathrooms. Mail was light, it didn't complain, and it paid better. But eventually, they started putting seats in the back. Western Air Express became TWA. Varney Airlines became United Airlines. Robertson Aircraft Corporation became part of American Airlines. Every major U.S. airline flying today can trace its DNA back to a mail contract. The ticket you buy to fly from Denver to Dallas is a legacy of the penny postcard. But before the suits and the stewardesses took over, there was a final golden twilight of the open cockpit. One of the pilots flying the mail in this transition era was a lanky, quiet young man named Charles Lindbergh. Before he crossed the Atlantic and became the most famous man on Earth, Lindbergh was Slim, a mail pilot on the St. Louis to Chicago run. He crashed twice while flying the mail. Both times he ran out of fuel in bad weather or darkness. Both times he parachuted out into the cornfields of Illinois. And both times his first concern upon hitting the ground was not his own bones, but the mail sack. There is a report from one of his crashes. Lindbergh lands in a field at night. He finds the wreckage of his plane. He pulls the mail sacks out of the burning fuselage. He then walks to a nearby farmhouse, introduces himself, and asks to use the phone to call the post office to send a truck. The mail must go through. It was not just a motto, it was a reflex. As we end this chapter, let us reflect on the transformation. In 1918, a plane was a dangerous toy that got lost 25 miles from home. By 1925, the plane was a reliable instrument of commerce, crisscrossing the continent day and night, guided by a highway of light. The Suicide Club had done its job. They had tamed the sky. But they paid a heavy price. If you go to the old airfields, you might find a memorial, a bronze plaque with a list of names: Dean Smith, William Maxfield, Maurice Graham. These men did not die in war. They died delivering the mail. They died hitting mountain peaks in the fog. They died freezing to death in the wreckage on a Wyoming plateau. They were the celestial messengers. Imagine the sound of the night sky in 1925. You are lying in bed in a farmhouse in Nebraska. It is silent. The wind rattles the window pane. Then you hear it, a low, distant drone. It gets louder. It passes directly overhead, a thundering vibration that shakes the dust from the rafters. You do not wake up fully. You just smile in your sleep. That's the mail, you think. It's on time. The sound of the engine fades to the east, towards Chicago, towards the sunrise. The pilot is up there, alone in the cold, watching the beacon flash, carrying the weight of the world on canvas wings.